not only do you get to work with artists who bring in different sensibilities, critical aesthetics, new forms of encountering technology, but you also get to occasionally bring in somebody that you've had the sort of quality that is important in all of this, and that is a friend and a collaborator and somebody who I've been able to see develop over the last 5 or 6 years into, I think, a very strong artivist, new media artist, and at this moment, Ian Allen Paul, the curator for the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History, finishing his PhD up at University of California, Santa Cruz. So I always have a real passion in having those that I've encountered in life become doctors. Makes me feel, that I've done something important to have so many doctors as friends. But what I like to do is just give a brief sense of the project in terms of the way that I have been reading it, and that is, how are we to conceive of the trajectory of a space that we now call Gitmo, that has now come to a close in 2010, and that the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History that commenced in 2012 allows us to rewind back to 1898, if you will, at least in the way I think, and to compress the moments that we've been through since 2001 and the issues around Gitmo and detention and almost infinite detention, and how are we sort of to imagine the future that emerges from that matrix of imprisonment in various forms. One of the qualities about Gitmo is that it is so very, very old. And when President Obama was attempting to shut down Gitmo, and of course it's a very layered process, a slow process, hyper-inert process, is that it's been with us, since 1898. And one of the surprising things about Gitmo is this issue of moving from a neo-colonial positionality to a neoliberal positionality, and that Gitmo from the beginning was a site of social experimentation in creating a non-space, an uncontrolled space. And I was reading Guantanamo, a working class history between empire and revolution by Dr. Jana K. Lipman. And she notes that Gitmo, isolated, remote, and self-sufficient, the U.S. naval base in Guantanamo Bay, was a prototype for the military's contemporary quest for flexible lily pads. Flexible, privatized subcontracting that is not bound to U.S. military rules, U.S. laws, regulations, and due process, as well as those of Cuba since 1898. And in 1939, under FDR, the non-space of Gitmo became a public-private enterprise. When Frederick Snare Corporation took over the running of Gitmo, the U.S. Navy was then able to insist that it had no jurisdiction or control over the running of Gitmo, and that Snare Corporation could not be regulated by U.S. laws. This was a prototyping, I think, for neoliberal policies we now see in the 21st century, from Blackwater and whatever it's called now to Halliburton. So this experiment has been one of long-term process, and it cascades into the period that we're probably most familiar with. I remember first encountering Gitmo in the mid-'80s during the HIV/AIDS crisis, when a great many Haitians were detained there at Gitmo around this particular issue. And it was the first time I became conscious of this sort of non-space and its history. And one of the qualities of Gitmo over that long period of time is the number of encounters that it initiated with what in 1898 they called those savage black people. Often those savage black people were imprisoned at Gitmo for various small issues. Cigarettes went missing, pencils. There was no element that the sense of imprisonment wasn't brought to the foreground in terms of a practice of this non-space. Probably one of the most well-known individuals who was detained, beaten, and tortured was Kid Chicle, who was a small-time boxer, was trying to get on a pontoon to get to Gitmo, to get a job, but the Snare Corporation didn't like his attitude as he was getting on the boat. So a manager from the Snare Corporation just told the U.S. Navy Marine, or not Marine, but the U.S. Navy representative on the pontoon to hit Kid Chicle and throw him off the pontoon. And so that was initiated one of the first well-known deaths. After that, a number of people who were protesting around Kid Chicle were brought in and detained and beaten, some killed. And the reports say that those who were detained during this early period, this is around the 1920s, the commander of Gitmo said they looked like Haitian zombies. And you can see a bit of a smirk in the way that he wrote it. So Gitmo is a site of experimentation that really becomes this kind of prototyping for public-private enterprises where there are no laws that are occurring. So the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History, initiated in 2012, curated by artist Ian Allen Paul, who is here and will take us through some of the thinking and development of the project. And I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with him about the issues that he brings to the foreground in the larger landscape, along with the artists he's collaborating. And I like to end with this quote from Jacques Rancière that's been important to my work, and I think to a lot of artists working in this kind of territory. The real must be fictionalized in order to be thought. Thank you, and let me introduce you to Ian Allen Paul.
Well, thank you, Ricardo, for that introduction. And I would like to thank Trish and Ricardo for really helping to bring the Guantanamo Bay Museum here. It wouldn't have been possible without both of your help, and I greatly appreciate it. So first, I would like to say that everyone that works at the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History was very excited when we first got news that we were invited to give an exhibition here. And it's part of our mission in the museum to really try to find new context to bring this conversation to, and to really expand the kinds of conversation around Guantanamo that are possible. And we feel that this exhibit here in San Diego is an extension of that mission, and we're really excited to have this talk tonight and the exhibition here for the next month and a half, and hope that a lot of really generative, exciting conversation kind of emerges from this context. So for those of you that are unfamiliar with the Guantanamo Bay Museum, I wanted to briefly give a background of the institution's history and familiarize you with some of the programs and operations of the museum. And then I'll briefly go on after that as well to talk about some of the concepts and ideas that inform our work at the museum, that guide our programming and guide our mission in the world after the closure of the Guantanamo Bay prison. So when the Guantanamo Bay prison was first decommissioned in 2010, and the last of the prisoners were being held, were finally processed and then eventually released, there was this immediate and pressing question that emerged about not only what to do at the prison facility itself now that prisoners are no longer there, but also how we could begin to historicize and memorialize what had happened in the prison. We felt that reflection is not something that just happens, but something that we have to produce, something that we have to produce communities and context for. And so immediately, different kinds of communities started to converge around the question of what it would mean to remember what happened at Guantanamo now that it had ceased functioning. So eventually, an international team of artists, intellectuals, activists, and students came together to start to plan what possible futures for the site we can envision together. And after a series of conferences, after funding had been sought, eventually it became clear that it would be possible to basically build the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History around the grounds of the prison and within the prison itself. So the museum's construction finished in 2012, 2 years after the prison had been closed. And we host a wide variety of exhibitions. We have a Center for Critical Studies at the site where we invite scholars to give talks and lectures on the topic of prisons and prison abolition. We have an artist in residency program at the museum where we invite artists to come to the island and work and produce new kinds of aesthetic objects around the history of Guantanamo. And we also give boat tours of the Guantanamo Bay itself. Because of the long kind of military history of the bay is very polluted, and so we have various ecological programs trying to rehabilitate the ecology of the bay. But of course, the history of Guantanamo extends much further back than just the prison itself. Closing the prison required extraordinary amounts of struggle and creativity, collaboration and collective action. So as many of you know, in 2009, Barack Obama ordered the closure of the prison with an executive order. But that actually didn't end up closing the prison. And it took a vast kind of collective of activists and artists that organized and agitated for the closure of the prison. And it was only more than a year later that this kind of vast coalition were able to succeed their mission. A section of the historical wing of the museum is permanently dedicated to memorializing these social movements and these organizations which ceaselessly struggled to close the prison and then to establish the museum afterwards. The organization No Pasarán is memorialized at the entrance of our exhibitions, and we also have included a library of exhibition catalogs from the various exhibitions which were organized as part of the campaign to close the Guantanamo Bay prison itself. So I was initially hired by the museum to be one of the curators at the end of 2012, and have since been working with writers and artists to introduce works into the museum's exhibitions and collections. And it's in this capacity as a curator that I'm going to be talking to you today about our programs, and I hope that I'll be able to clarify the function of the museum and help you understand perhaps what we're trying to do and continue to try to do in these different contexts. I often reflect on the etymology of the word curator when I'm trying to think about what I'm trying to do in the museum. Interestingly, the word curator comes from the Latin cura, which simultaneously means to care for, which is perhaps the meaning that we're more used to, but it also means to trouble. And so this idea of caring for something and also troubling it, I think is very much what we're trying to do in our institution. I hope you all will be able to actually visit the museum itself in Cuba soon. Part of our collection is hosted here through the end of the month, but it would be really exciting if you could actually visit the museum itself. We at the museum feel it's incredibly important to both kind of memorialize the events that occurred while the prison was still in operation, but also serve as kind of a discursive platform to prevent future Guantanamos from appearing. So very much thinking about history as something that we actively keep alive as a kind of weapon in the present. So now I'm going to kind of transition into the second part of my talk, where I'm going to start talking about some of the ideas and concepts that inform our work and that we try to keep present in our own conversation and thinking about Guantanamo. The first of these ideas is that justice as a thing or as a concept never arrives, but is perpetually yet to come. This idea I'll elaborate upon, but the general sense of it is that justice perpetually remains in the future. The second idea that I want to kind of raise for us in our conversations and to help you maybe think about our exhibition when we go over there after the talk is that the role of creative and intellectual critique is not to describe crises, so it's not to better explicate on the function of power or the structure of power, but rather the role of critique is actually to produce crises, so to insert kinds of turbulence or kinds of disruption into power structures. And this is also something that we hope the museum does. So when visitors first arrive at the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History, they are greeted by a plaque inside the main entrance that is inscribed with a quote from the philosopher Jacques Derrida. The quote reads, "At any given time, juridical limits can be contested in the name of a justice yet to come." When the architects of the museum decided to place this text at the entrance of the museum, we meant to position the museum itself as existing in a particular lineage of thought in relation to justice. What is so unique about the way that Derrida frames the question is that he does not write of justice in the present singular, as something that is graspable and already here with us. Instead, for Derrida, justice always exists only in the future, as something we only can move in relation to, something that we're never actually able to arrive at. So this importantly reminds us that the existence of injustice in the present, the idea that we live in an unjust present in an imperfect world, already conditions our ability to conceptualize justice and to struggle for more just futures. So it's not enough to simply engage in the struggle for a better world or for what we imagine as a better world, but we also must kind of incessantly remain in the struggle of redefining our imagination of a better world in the first place. And so in this kind of processual relation with the future, justice remains more of a verb for us, something we do, and not a noun, something that we can grasp or easily define. So in this nonlinear frame of a justice yet to come, we could think of time and justice in relation to another thinker's writing, Walter Benjamin. For Walter Benjamin, history was more a series of constellations than a straight line. A series of intensities and ruptures and different historical moments that were really left up to us to draw lines between, to make sense of, to drag into the present to produce different kinds of constellational future. Both of these thinkers' writings have greatly informed the work of the Guantanamo Bay Museum, particularly in the way that the Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility has been closed, but we don't think that there's actually any kind of closure that's occurred. And so even though the facility has stopped functioning, all the questions that the Guantanamo facility raised while it was in operation are still presently with us. This mission, this kind of refusal of closure around the prison, is very much kind of in solidarity with some of Donna Haraway's writing, her kind of demand that we stay with the trouble, that we stay in these kind of messy social and political arrangements, because that's precisely where life is found and where new kinds of futures can be produced. We are pushed into new and unfamiliar terrains of thought and action, which are often dangerous and impossible to anticipate when we enter into these kind of troubled territories. So there are no answers in these territories, no finalities, no closures. Justice remains a verb in relation with the future that is irreducibly complex and plural. It is something that is only ever glimpsed when we do it together in kind of collective concert. So differential justice in relation to Guantanamo in this sense is a way that we try to move in this world as a museum. We refuse to ask what justice is, but instead ask what justice can do, or what we can do with justice. The radical potential offered to us by justice, in this sense, remains here with us, kind of enfolded and imbricated in the present and always kind of unsettling the present and the past. It just takes a willingness to kind of risk imagining and articulating new possibilities in relation to the present that reignites this kind of potentiality of justice. So part of what we were trying to do at the museum when we invite artists and scholars to produce work, when we hold conferences and events, when we organize exhibitions in other institutions like we are here in San Diego, is we're trying to create the kinds of conditions under which these further disruptions can take place, to invite the kinds of conversations and re-articulations of the past, of the present, and of the future, and most of all to create a space and time for imagining resistance in relation to the past, present, and future together. So resistance has historically taken many different forms. Occupations, strikes, exhibitions, acts of sabotage, declarations, demonstrations. History is composed as a series of these disobediences, each forming a radical break with their status quo. What all resistance shares in common, however, is the impulse to both create consequential disturbances in the present, so to introduce these forms of turbulence and refusal in the present, while simultaneously setting the stage for new kinds of presents, new kinds of times, new kinds of futures. And so it's this simultaneous refusal and affirmation that we find in acts of resistance that, again, we find so key to what we're trying to do at our museum. However, I think we also have to go further than that when we think about resistance. Well, it's tempting to think of resistance as something that emerges only ever in response to injustice, as if it's something that we incessantly retreat to when we find oppression or injustice in the world. Instead, I would like to kind of reverse that relation. I would like to say that resistance, when we find it in the world, is the true kind of productive moment, that history actually emerges from moments of resistance, these kinds of deviations and disturbances that take place. And that power actually has to incessantly respond to these kinds of turbulences and disturbances. And so if we're interested in thinking about what it would mean to produce a different kind of present, a different kind of world, I think we have to necessarily become invested in these kinds of moments of resistance, the moments that we can glimpse radically other worlds, radical other ways of living with each other. So every act of resistance in this way is ultimately without promises. It's a kind of horizon that we can never reach, and it requires deliberative risk-taking, attentiveness, endurance. Moreover, we can never know in advance whether an act of resistance will be successful. We can't predict it in that way. And we can't even know really what it will bring about, so it's not instrumental, it's rather experimental. The different modalities and forms that our resistances take have the capacity to shape the ways in which possible futures fold over onto our present, producing new directions that were illegible before we entered into the act of resistance in the first place. And so history itself is a product of these resistances that continuously reshape the boundaries of our political and ethical imaginations. And so when we talk about trying to create these kinds of interventions in the mission of our museum, in the different events we organize, it's very much about not trying to destroy something in the world or not trying to necessarily cause a certain kind of cessation of something that we consider unjust. But again, it's trying to produce the conditions for new kinds of living and new kinds of practices that emerge from the conditions of resistance itself. So our ability to engage with justice in this way is ultimately dependent on our capacity to imagine worlds that are decidedly different than our own. It's a technique of generating differentials between an already existing historical world and other possible historical worlds that allow for differential movement through time that could perhaps allow for more just presents, more just past, more just futures. The popular protest slogan of the anti-globalization movement, "Another world is possible," in this sense is prerequisite of justice. This idea of there being another world is a concept that we need actually for something like justice to be possible, for something like resistance to allow us to move in these undetermined directions. Similarly, the popular Zapatista slogan, "El mundo que queremos es uno donde quepan muchos mundos," which translates to, "We want a world in which many worlds fit," Similarly kind of urges us to think about these radically other worlds that are always kind of nested in the present with us. And so it's not simply enough for us to kind of analyze the world and the forms of power in the world to understand them and make clear their supports. Although, of course, this is also necessary. This kind of work is required of us in certain ways. But it's also necessary that we intervene in the world, that we find ways of thinking and acting that substantively create new kinds of conditions. The Guantanamo Bay Museum and all of our work that we do in the institution is very much built around the idea that creative and intellectual critique not only describes crises in these ways, but hopes to produce them. And so in the end, as a curator of the museum and also and the broader institution itself, none of us can really promise more just futures, futures where there are less kind of injustices present, nor the arrival of communities of people that will actually be able to achieve these kinds of justice. Resistance doesn't work this way. It's not something that can provide us kind of knowable futures. Instead, I would urge us to kind of hold on to this idea of justice as if it were a weapon or a tool, something that we can only navigate with and travel with, something that can potentially do things with us when we carry it with us, and that can be used to carve out and defend new kinds of political and ethical territory. So learning how to act against injustice, the injustice of prisons, the injustice of torture, the injustice of disappearance, means attenuating ourselves to the ways in which living within the world necessarily affects history, taking into account the ways our resistant acts enmesh us with the world. It commands us that we thoroughly entangle ourselves with our capacity to think and to imagine, to remember the old and envisage the new collectively, to be swept up in the forces of our ethical imaginations, unanticipated solidarities and collective actions, and approach unwritten futures as though they were full of possibility, as each of our thoughts are. And with that, I think I'll wrap up the talk and invite Ricardo back up so we can have a conversation. And then I really look forward to talking with you all during the question and answer period. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that always strikes me about trying to function by establishing institutions or gestures or disturbances that function under what I would call the politics of the question. And it's a politics of the question that always, in a certain sense, runs parallel and echoes sort of history, the present and the future, but is always sort of alongside it, if you will. And often what occurs in that politics of the question is that we begin to see those moments of erasure, what isn't available, what becomes imperceptible, how the sort of institutions that function under the politics of the answer respond to this kind of parallel constellations, if you will. And one of the things that struck me early on, I think it was maybe about 2 years ago, there was a sort of encounter with Google Maps, if you will. And certainly it seemed to me that some of those issues about erasure, imperceptibility, visibility, invisibility were at play. Can you give us a little bit of a sense of how Google Maps dealt with the museum?
Yeah, and so for those that are unfamiliar with the way Google Maps operates, a lot of government and military areas in Google Maps are kind of dataless territories in the sense that there's some satellite imagery of them, but not any road data or not any geological data or any other kinds of data sets that you can find in other parts of Google Maps. And so with the Google Corporation, we've had this kind of ongoing contestation where the Guantanamo Bay Detention Facility, for example, never existed on Google Maps officially because of its military status. But then when the military closed and our museum was built, our museum was added as an entry on Google Maps. And that was another form of engagement for the museum. But now we end up in this kind of interesting dilemma where Google occasionally censors the museum, and we're not sure why. We think it's because of this history of the prison. and there's some sort of data collision going on between the history of the prison and the emergence of the museum. But the museum also continuously reemerges. So we find people who have visited the museum and have become involved in our programs actually contribute the museum again to the Google Maps service. And so this is just one instance of, I think, the way in which the museum really operates the history in this way. It's about trying to acknowledge certain kinds of history, the ongoing history of carcerality, and how these pasts, even though they may be past, aren't fully past in the sense that we have not gone past them, right? But also that the presence of the museum is meant to kind of haunt these things, right? And is haunted by them. And so these ways in which they continually coexist and kind of our intention with one another is kind of an ineradicable part of the project, I think.
Well, one of the sort of outcomes of this parallel encounter, right, between history, present, and future is the way that, again, the imperceptible emerges and dissipates based on the way people organize around it. And at least recently in our conversations since 2012, and I was part of this committee, a transcontinental committee, of trying to establish a center for critical abolition studies. And it was difficult to begin to find a sort of container for what doesn't want to be spoken about and dealt with. And with the support of a number of initiatives here at UCSD, we've been able to really sort of plant the seeds, begin to open ground on the center. And so can you give us a little bit of insight in terms of how the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History functioned with different groups in order to establish it? And if you haven't seen it, it's over by the library, I think on the west side. Yeah.
Well, just a preface to this is that something we feel very strongly about at the museum is that any kind of resistance or any kind of even the process of imagination itself is never a singular act, right? And so we at the museum know that what we are doing by ourselves is never going to accomplish actually what we want to see in the world. And so one of the things we really insist upon is the process of collaboration, the process of alliance, the process of coalition that brings us into contact and conversation with other groups. And fortunately, our collaboration here at UC San Diego has led to one of these exciting new initiatives that we hope can exceed the mission of the museum itself and even take on its own life. Through the foundation of a Center for Critical Abolition Studies on campus, we're hoping that new kinds of work can be done that even we couldn't imagine in the past. And hopefully communities here will get taken up by it.
Well, I think one of the things that is really important about the center is that, one of our alumni, Angela Davis, is certainly one of the lead thinkers and figures contesting this kind of global prison complex in the way it creates racial scripting, in the way it, again, creates these non-sites as a spillage, if you will. And certainly I think to initiate a discussion around the aesthetics of the explosion of detention, the explosion of prisons, wherein it really becomes almost impossible to think a world without, right? And that's certainly part of the history of the abolition movement, and certainly part of our history here at UCSD to try to think that out. And so one of the things that's really exciting about the center is being able to create a space where somebody like Angela Davis can be part of the community and begin to open that discussion right now, especially in California, where so much of the sort of funding and tax dollars goes to initiate this kind of space. Anyway, I'm really excited by the center and hopefully a lot of different things will be done. The archive from Gitmo will be here as well.
That's right. Yeah, part of the mission of the new center will be hosting the archive of all the official documents from the prison. That's something that we really intently wanted to be in the U.S. so it could be more accessible to scholars and artists, and people on campus will now have access to the archive.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing that I noted in the archive was sort of the development of patterns in torture and dismantling of individuals, how-tos, if you will, and you know that sometimes is something that is erased. We hear about certain things, but sort of the everyday use of these techniques. And what was interesting to me to read the history was, again, how rooted it was from its very beginning. Who was tortured, how they were tortured, becoming zombies, if you will, as part of the prerogative, and very early on to become this kind of lily pad, a strange term for the neoliberal expansion, if you will. But maybe I'll open up to the community here in terms of any questions we might have about the museum or the center. Or any other questions you might have for Ian. Yes?
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the Idea Lab, and maybe you did and I missed it because I came a little bit late. Sorry about that. But I'm really excited to know about ways that we can be involved also in this work along with this project.
Yeah, so the Idea Lab was something that we had done at Brown University when we had an exhibition there. And we invited people that had participated in the exhibition and the talks to contribute proposals for the museum, future programs and things like this. It's not something, unfortunately, we were able to implement here. But one of the things that we're really intent on emphasizing is, again, this idea of collaboration. And so we always invite people to write to us and propose things they would like to do at the museum. As I mentioned during my talk, we have an artist in residency program, so I was looking for artists to produce new work for our exhibitions. And so if anyone does have ideas or proposals that they would like to either collaborate with us or work within the institution itself, yeah, I would really encourage you to get in touch. Yeah.
Any other thoughts or questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering if the museum has ever referenced or thought about collaborating with any of the U.S. internment camps, or how the museum feels about their interpretation about those closed sites.
Mm-hmm. You mean, do you mean the internment camps during World War II, or?
Correct.
Yeah. No, unfortunately, we haven't been able to have that kind of encounter, although that's precisely the kind of history we're interested in. That, you know, the idea is that that these histories are all really kind of imbricated, right? That Guantanamo so often is framed as this kind of really exceptional thing in U.S. history. That's this one kind of aberration that emerged following the War on Terror, had a brief life and then was closed, and this is kind of an exception to what might be considered the U.S. history, right? Whereas really what a lot of the kind of critical and historical work we try to do in the museum is very much trying to link the history of Guantanamo to these other kinds of histories of carcerality like you're bringing up. Talk about how the history of the state of exception, the history of kind of extrajudicial legal authority during, you know, these states of war, really are kind of part of the fabric of the American legal system and the American military. And this is something that, again, even though the prison is officially closed, it's something that we feel, again, really continues to haunt the present now in the things like the drone program and things like this that continue to operate in similar legal territory. And that's why we really insist that we kind of continue to think through these problems, because they're still very much with us. Right?
And one of the things that struck me when I was having a conversation with the Guantanamo Municipal Museum in Guantanamo City was the kind of intense border culture that Gitmo created in relationship to Guantanamo City, that is not only a kind of almost moat culture of removal, but also using Guantanamo City as a kind of access to excess. And so at the Guantanamo Municipal Museum, there's a sort of statistics that they got after Gitmo was closed about the level of alcoholism that so many of the sort of military and corporate people functioned under, so that often the internal violence within the Gitmo Detention Center was often spilling out literally into Guantanamo City, so that you had this kind of hierarchy of violence, not only with the sex workers there, with laborers and others. And so, one of the outcomes of these sort of non-spaces of violence is the way they borderize and then spill out. Again, this kind of Kid Chicle and the Haitian zombies, all these images seem to me also part of this history of the non-sites of violence that are global in nature, is that they create hard borders for that violence to sort of, spill out and be contained or imagined containment. So one of the things that I'm interested in is to bring in that sort of history that is at the border artificially and I don't know, established as a social maintenance zone, if you will. Anyway, are there any other questions in terms of the project? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Say perhaps we wanted to organize a visit, of VIPs from UCSD to come visit the museum. What would that entail?
Mm-hmm. So we have program coordinators at the museum that help to manage trips and everything. Unfortunately, this is kind of a side note, but there have been a lot of military exercises around the museum that have prevented some trips recently, and so people haven't been able to visit over the last month, unfortunately. But and also, like you're saying, because of the specific kind of legal and juridical and territorial complexity of a place like Guantanamo Bay, being kind of outside of the United States, having the military history, being close to Cuba, which still doesn't have regularized political relations with the U.S., you can understand that planning these trips can become quite complicated and very quickly. But it's something that, again, we're very intent on working with various communities to organize these things.
And one of the things that I noted recently was that there was a lot of sort of yacht populace going. Because obviously if you have a yacht, it's a lot easier to get to the museum. If you don't have a yacht, it's a little bit more difficult, of course. And so against this kind of who gets access and who doesn't. But at least in conversations, you recently sort of had these discussions with sort of the yacht community.
Yeah. So we get a lot of school groups that would like to come. And so that's, I think, our primary audience at the museum, particularly because it requires a good amount of, it's not easy to make the trip for a lot of people. But yeah, it's especially as kind of global income inequality gets worse and worse, and we see this new kind of yacht class emerging on the oceans of the world. We now have been receiving more and more requests, docking requests at the museum. For these yachts to come in, which again is very complicated given the polluted nature of the bay, and also having to provide security for the yachts against the local population. And it raises a whole other set of problems that we're now actively trying to work through at the institution as well.
Well, again, I think navigation in these kind of parallel spaces that are nested in one another is, again, part of the difficulty of allowing the work to be encountered in the lived. And so you have to sort of set up these satellites in order to allow audiences who aren't the yacht class access to it. The other thing, when I was at the in Guantanamo City at the museum, the Guantanamo Municipal Museum, was that Gitmo in the late 50s and early 60s was a main staging zone for refugees to get into the U.S. without papers. So when Fidel took over Cuba, you had all these Cubans entering Gitmo, and basically Gitmo was able to pass them into Florida quickly, efficiently, and without papers, which I think was probably the most positive thing that Gitmo ever did. And so my question is, can we imagine these non-spaces of power being reshifted from sort of containment to allowing free passage, or what we were discussing earlier, flight facilitation, especially since there is this kind of private military coordination that might be available?
Yeah, it's unfortunately something that I didn't get to talk too much about today. But the history of the Guantanamo Bay area is very much defined by this idea of the state of exception, right? Mm-hmm. These kinds of emergency measures that nation states use to suspend all of their normal laws and all of the rights that they grant various populations because of a perceived need to protect the nation state from threats. And so mm-hmm. this is something we've seen really become magnified in the U.S. after September 11th, and something that really defined the prison itself. But something that we're really interested in doing in the museum is there's this kind of state of exception that was created for the security situation. We also have been able to create various kinds of states of exception with our museum itself because of the specific and particular nature of the territory. Mm-hmm. And so just as there are, for example, free trade zones that exist around the world where various trade laws are kind of lifted to basically proliferate certain mm-hmm. kinds of free trade policies, we've actually been able to establish a free travel zone in the Guantanamo Bay Museum grounds, essentially meaning that people of all nationalities are able to travel without passport control and all these kinds of things. Which really, again, expands our audience and hopefully prefigures the kinds of changes that we would like. And so part of that is really trying to rethink this question of the state of exception. The state of exception isn't something that simply happens to us or that nation states use to kind of to increase their powers, but rather we should also feel that we can kind of introduce states of exception, that we can suspend the order of things and introduce new kinds of policies that we would like to.
Yeah, and what's really important is that we can look at that history and already see flight facilitation as being part of that history. Again, how can we add to it? And I think that's an important consideration. Well, yes, go ahead.
My understanding is that 10 prisoners were released to go to Oman, leaving 93 somewhere. Do you have any relationship with the remaining prisoners? And the space that they're in, and any comments on that?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the museum is incredibly interested in is the kind of relationship between fact and fiction, particularly in relation to this idea of the political imagination. And so one of the things that we think is very important in relation to politics is actually what we allow ourselves to believe, or what we allow ourselves to believe is possible. Yeah. Guantanamo Bay Prison, when it was still in operation, kind of occupied this really interesting space where on the one hand it seemed inevitable that it would close because it was incredibly unpopular as an institution both on the right and the left in the US, but at the same time seemed really impossible to close because of various legal and political and juridical problems that the prison had brought up essentially when it was founded. And so I think what we're really trying to do is create the conditions under which we can reflect upon our own political imaginations in relation to what is possible, and really again return to this question that what we believe or what we allow ourselves to believe actually is a politics unto itself, that it allows us to do certain things in the world or create certain kinds of relations that wouldn't exist otherwise. And so that is how we kind of relate to history and relate to possibility. If that's, yeah.
All right. Yes.
So two questions. One, I thought it'd be interesting if you created a cruise, since it has such a nice climate and there is such a large yacht culture. If there could be some kind of fun cruise that could be created around. So I think there could be a lot of really interesting interpretive dance and performances on the cruise that you could bring and tour. Any thoughts on a possible kind of Disney line this?
Yeah, Disney Carnival, like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's good.
On one hand, also, do you ever actually bring this exhibit to other current detention facilities? Because I know there are art classes at current facilities, and then maybe you could have some type of like this as an example, and then maybe bring some of the current artwork from current inmates back to this museum, and kind of have this artist in residency, also artist incarceration trade.
Yeah, I think both those ideas are really excellent. I mean, we're always looking for new ways to bring people to the museum, and I think the yacht and cruise industry again is one of the ways that we can do this. It certainly again is complicated, but I'm sure we can find a way to organize it bureaucratically within the institution. And then the second point about collaborating with sites of former incarceration or sites of active incarceration, again, is something we're very interested in doing. The Guantanamo Bay Museum will actually be having another exhibition in Poland later this year, and we're really excited to engage with the kind of history of incarceration and the history of camps in Poland, right? And so again, we're only so many people, and we only have so much time, and we wish we could do shows everywhere, but if such an opportunity arose, I think it would be something that would be very exciting for the institution.
Yeah, and one of the discussions I had recently with Ai Weiwei after his Alcatraz show was this kind. We were together at a gathering in New York called Fear of Art, and one of the things that I think would be good with somebody like Ai Weiwei is there you have an international figure who's very much focused on the aesthetics of imprisonment, the aesthetics of torture, and you know, at least in discussions with him, I think the sort of exchange that you're pointing to is something that I think would mobilize him, and I think he is quite interested in the museum, the way it's being organized. So, you know, sometime in the future, perhaps we could have a Disney Carnival cruise with kind of reproduction of different detainment centers, perhaps, you know, I don't know, holding people for long periods of time, serving them really bad food, showing them bad Disney films, I suppose, along the way, to inculcate the sort of larger scale of imprisonment and detainment and the nausea that might create along the way. Yeah?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, now I have two things. Well, the first thing is just that I was wondering about the role, reaction, and reception by families of the incarcerated, specifically at Guantanamo Bay, but or you know maybe anyone else with loved ones in prison, and then maybe a caveat about. Fetishizing or comicalizing people's suffering a bit. I mean, I like the idea of a cruise ship or a large vessel that's going to give access to poor people and to people most likely targeted by incarceration to be able to go and reflect on some of these things and participate. I mean, at some point, it can become sort of like, I don't know, black people's playground, and I'm not so sure that's what the spirit of, all of this work has been about. So I'm just throwing that out
Yeah, so
Yeah.
two different points. Yeah, so the first point would be about the former prisoners of the museum or the prison, and that's something that we when we were designing the museum found very important to reach out to people that had been incarcerated at the prison and to solicit certain kinds of feedback. And we had been in contact with lawyers that had been active in the prison and all sorts of kinds of things. And so that was very much a part of how we thought about the project and how we thought about curating materials. And unfortunately, for various reasons, it didn't work out for any of the prisoners themselves to submit materials for the museum, although perhaps in the future this will become possible. But yeah, this is kind of emphasizing the agency of the former incarcerated again I think is critical to any kind of project that would imagine different kinds of future in relation to incarceration. The second point about the danger of trivializing certain kinds of histories of violence or having certain kinds of humorous approaches to various serious things is well taken. I think that during my talk, when I was trying to emphasize this notion of kind of justice as being perpetually something that's delayed, something that never quite arrives, is really kind of critical, I think, to hold on to with projects, right? That we can never be satisfied with a certain kind of result or a certain kind of interruption or act of resistance, because it always kind of proliferates new kinds of injustice that we need to be concerned with. And so, for example, for Guantanamo Bay Prison to be closed, but then for global income inequality to still basically produce a world under which people are driving around on yachts and alongside militarized border zones and these kinds of things, is very much about insisting that injustice remains very much a part of these histories. And so the project is very much not about trying to establish a certain kind of utopian institution that's perfect and inhabits all of the kinds of desires that we might project into the world, but rather tries to, again, stay with certain kinds of trouble and make apparent certain kinds of conflicts that still persist in the present. Does that make sense?
And I think sometimes.
No, I mean, I'm not saying, because I think humor and satire and, like, I think there's a lot of things that can be done. I just, wanted to say, there's like that careful, maybe tightrope there of like, you don't want to go too far into certain territories or you may end up kind of flipping your mission on its head.
Well, I think that's sort of the tension in the karaoke of torture songs in the exhibit, right? The tension, say, from Noriega to Waco to Gitmo used popular culture, right, to torture the detained. And so what does it mean to have karaoke night singing that list, right? What is the difference between the songs that were used to torture Noriega, that were used to torture Waco and the Gitmo? So again, that tension between, how does one create a humor that creates critical distance in order to make those imperceptible moments, and at the same time, I think the issues of racial scripting are so clear, and economic scripting, that it can't be lost. But I think sometimes the tension in the art pieces is that sort of play, and it's not always easy to navigate. I agree. Yes, you want to ask a question?
Oh, yes. I had two questions. First is, I was wondering if deals any with the Spanish-American War, which led to the original establishment of Guantanamo, and I wonder if you deal any with the question of the blowing up of the Bay, which was given as the cause of war with the United States for the war against Spain. And I guess, I don't know if you put it in the area of conspiracy theory or just potential history as to
To answer the first question, that the museum doesn't really explicitly deal with the longer history of the Guantanamo Bay, although it's a very interesting and complex and important history. It very much focuses just on the time that the facility was operational following the War on Terror. And so that's very much what it remains focused on. Again, in a perfect world, I think it would be very interesting to produce more content around the longer history, and I think Ricardo's introduction today was able to hint at some of those histories in productive ways. And again, with your question, it's I think the more we can kind of add complexity to these kinds of situations, the better. And so hopefully, again, we'll have an opportunity to do something like that. The second question is no, unfortunately, we haven't gotten a chance to deal with the film. Guantanamo has kind of produced all these pop cultural representations of it. Banksy has produced a lot of work around Guantanamo, and there have been several films now. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just interesting how it occupies a place in American culture, and hopefully will continue to produce more, again, complex and nuanced kinds of reflections, because it's something at the museum we feel is incredibly important, that we don't allow Guantanamo to vanish or disappear, that we keep it very present in our future, right? Yeah.
And so not only do we remember the Maine, we remember Gitmo along the way. All right, well, thank you very much. Oh, were you going to ask something? I'm sorry, before we go. Yeah, go ahead.
I have two questions. I came in halfway through, so I don't know if you've already talked about them. One of them is I was wondering who are the authors of the art in the exhibition? Like, where does the art come from? And kind of what sorts of demographics? Also, I was wondering how you deal ethically with like the flow of money that the museum probably has to deal with. Where it's coming from? Is it coming from museum visitors or from like government sponsorship, and then where does it go?
So the first question about the artists is that the social movements that closed the prison, once the prison had been closed, they kind of continued to engage in these processes of planning what would follow, and eventually it became clear that the museum would be constructed, and so conversations really emerged from those kinds of mobile and dynamic collectivities. There weren't specific kinds of organizations or anything that were involved, but rather these networks of academics and artists that really planned the museum together. And it was from those networks that people started to produce work, and that some of our first exhibitions, and especially the work here, emerged from those artists. Again, we continue to add to our collections, and so we hope that we can continue to expand upon our kind of transnational collaboration. The second question about the question of money is that, yeah, unfortunately, like every kind of institution, a large institution, it's always kind of plaguing the institution, the question of kind of survival and reproducing itself as an institution over time. And we're able to support the museum, again, largely through various membership programs, fortunately, and also through museum visitors. And so we haven't actually had to go out and seek grants or anything like that. And costs have remained fairly low. And so far, like every institution, it's something we're concerned about, but not something that has produced any crises within the institution yet. Yeah.
All right. Well, there's food and wine and the exhibition itself. Thank you so very much to the Guantanamo Bay Museum of Art and History, to Ian Allen Paul, and all of you. Thank you, Cal IT2, QI, Ramesh Rao, Trish Mouth, Trish Stone, and Hector and the crew, wherever you are. Muchas gracias. Buenas noches.
Yeah. Thank you for coming here.